I want to talk to you about, how technology and these new forms of governance and organization are transforming the world. And I just wanted to start with this kind of basic fact. The ability of technology and these new rapidly formed forms of organization to create very quickly a sense of solidarity, a sense of collective power, a sense that an individual can be connected much more broadly and form these new sources of power that didn't exist before. This is a fundamental fact. And so, we're seeing it everywhere now in Russia, we're going to see it in places like Nigeria, we're going to see it in China. And this fact is going to very much more quickly transform the way we make social change, than anything that has come before. So I want to do a little bit of my own storytelling. I don't know how much you guys know about my background, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the sort of stuff that I've been doing. And I want to start by telling you the story of a group that I started in Australia called Get Up. So basically, the context for this organization, a new form of, if you like, political organization was in 2005. I'd been over in the US watching my home country of Australia, in my view, kind of go down the toilet a little bit. We had a very conservative Prime Minister called John Howard, who most of you, I hope, don't follow Australian politics, so I hope you don't know anything about John Howard. But he was a very conservative guy. He was sort of like George Bush's poodle, but maybe the smaller version of George Bush's poodle with Tony Blair as the larger poodle. And he was just very conservative on social policy, terrible on the environment. He was one of the only two countries to refuse to sign the Kyoto Protocol because we had to be loyal to the Bush administration's view on climate change. And on every issue that we cared about, he dragged the country back. He'd been in power for almost 10 years when we started Get Up. And so we decided to make an intervention that was an attempt to kind of shake up politics back in Australia. And hopefully this will be an interesting story or a cautionary tale for your own efforts to sort of rejuvenate politics in Argentina. And so we were faced with a situation where the main opposition party, the Labor Party as it's called in Australia, was kind of hopeless. No one was inspired by them. They weren't mobilizing or engaging people in any way. So we felt like the way to make a change was not to work within the system institutionally and try to fix the broken institutions. We decided instead to just create an entirely new source of power. And we'd been in the US the year before in the presidential elections experimenting with these new forms of technology-driven political organization. And we'd gone from kind of these, me and this guy who started this organization in America had gone from a couple of guys who'd never run a political campaign. And by the end of the campaign, again, because we were able to create this very interesting group of women whose loved ones were in Iraq, we'd raised like millions of dollars in micro donations, and we'd flown these women around the country chasing Dick Cheney on a private jet and did all sorts of other really crazy stuff. And so we'd done that, and we went back to Australia and we said, okay, let's not try to work within the Labor Party or within the opposition party. Let's blow this thing up. Let's just try to kind of create something new that creates a sense of power for people and that gives people that sense of agency. So we decided to create this thing called Get Up. And so when we started Get Up, this was the launch television ad. We declare Australians are starting a new movement. And unfortunately, there really wasn't a movement. So the ad was my sister and my niece, who sort of were the stars of the ad. And so, we didn't have a lot to mobilize. But what we did, wait, that ruins the suspense. I have to do some storytelling. So we launched. I never know which slide deck I'm playing with, so we may get some very strange slides. So we basically had the situation where we launched this thing and we said, okay, guys, we built some technology that made it really easy for people to directly contact their members of parliament, their members of Congress. And so we said, just write to your member of Congress directly and say, you will hold them to account. You're no longer relying on the existing institutions, and write to them and tell them about the issues that you intend to hold them account for. Very simple, right? But in Australia at that time, no one had actually thought to use technology to radically simplify the process of contacting your member of parliament. So we launched this thing, and we had literally in a couple of days, like tens of thousands of people write to the politicians, and they'd never been subject to this kind of thing. And so the government got up on national television a couple of days later, and they were like outraged. So they got up and they said, this is outrageous. Our computers are paralyzed. We've never received so many emails. This is spam. And we sort of said, wait a minute. This is a democracy. And tens of thousands of people had written their own individual letters to their representatives, and the government got up and called it spam. And so, as you can imagine, people were pretty pissed off about this. And so, again, the power of these new forms of organization. We were this little tiny thing, family, friends, my sister, my niece. They were the government, and I might add the Murdoch press, who were also working very closely together to try to undermine this new thing, because I thought, this is all a little bit slick. It's all a little bit, kind of, this is interesting. And so, they got up, they did that, and then, of course, that's how the movement started to grow, because, people were like, okay, this sounds cool. We'll donate to that, if the government's calling it spam. And so the next thing we knew, we started to pick up momentum, and just within a couple of months, we had tens of thousands of people. And then, within a couple of years, we were the biggest political organization in the country. And because we were able to use these online techniques to really rapidly aggregate people, but we weren't just aggregating people, we were also giving them a sense that they were actually participating in politics. So, for most people, the only participation you do in politics is like, you go to the ballot box, you vote for some depressing candidate who you kind of hate, and you go home, and then you complain. And so this was all about giving people a sense of power and saying, okay, there are all of these issues that I know, you care about, right? Like how, for our group in Australia, it was climate change, it was the treatment of refugees, it was funding for our version of the BBC, the ABC. There were all of these issues that we knew people cared about, and we understood, their psychology, and so we actually gave them campaigns around which they could take action, and we actually started to win. So, the government had this policy of putting children into these kind of prisons while they were waiting for their refugee applications to be processed. So these are people who've come from Afghanistan on a boat, and if they're lucky, they've made it to Australia. You can imagine, right? And the government's like, great, we'll put you into jail. This is 8-year-old children. So obviously, this is not a particularly progressive human rights framework. So we said, okay, let's stop this. And so we actually ran a huge campaign, and we managed to get a bill into Parliament which defeated this, and which meant that children could no longer be placed in refugee detention. And so people who'd been complaining about this for years, who'd then been involved in this campaign, where hundreds of thousands of people had done this, suddenly were like, whoa, actually I can do this. This is meaningful. And it began to build this sense of solidarity and community among these people. And so this is GetUp today. And the reason I show you these photos is that what's important about where GetUp has gone is it isn't just people clicking on their computers. It isn't just an online community. The trick with this sort of mobilization is, can you get people to dress up their dogs in t-shirts? Do they actually have a sense of identity, a sense of connection to the organization? And that's what GetUp has been able to do. People really own it. These are grandmas and little kids, and it's a family thing. So it's not like sort of the brand of GetUp is very mainstream. It doesn't feel kind of institutional, but nor does it feel kind of super scary radical, so that it only appeals to people like us who are kind of a little radical, right? So it's actually something that is inclusive of a much bigger swathe of the community. And so and it's very kind of hopeful and optimistic and positive. Which is a really important part of the movement. And so, GetUp today has about 1 in 20 Australian adults are actually members of GetUp. And so it's an enormously powerful political constituency. And using this model of microdonations, it's able to really scale the impact of its work. And because it's multi-issue, not single issue, it also has this remarkable capacity to mobilize not just people in the environment or people in human rights, or people in social justice, but people across those issues, all of whom actually basically share the same worldview and the same values. And this is a really important insight. So, this is just to give you a little texture. This is a thing I stumbled on last year. It was a newspaper article where, it was just one of the articles covering a GetUp campaign, and the comments stream, for the article, I always read the comments to say, what are people saying about GetUp? And somebody attacked GetUp in the comments. And what was amazing to me, and this was the moment where as an organizer and as a movement builder, you realize that actually something's happening. These people are actually invested in this organization. was when this person attacked Get Up, and then this incredible stream of hundreds of people rushed to defend it. And the way they defended it was very interesting, I thought. So one person here says, "I am Get Up." And then this next person says, "Like Meg, I am Get Up, and my partner, sister, mother, father, and many of my friends. I am Get Up too, so is my wife and daughter. None of us belong to any political party, union, or Tea Party for that matter." And so you see here again this sort of, they're identifying with the organization because it feels like something that's really inclusive of them, but they're deliberately contrasting that to the old institutions. The political party, the union, these are institutions that alienate, whereas Get Up is an institution that they're feeling part of. It's a community-based group. Most of the members are actually older. Hell, I'm bloody ancient. This is Australian talk, by the way, guys. This bloody means very. And I joined, and I'm not a member of these political parties. Get Up is an organization, this is someone else. Get Up is an organization that constantly refers back to its membership for direction on what we, the membership, would like them to do. As far as its funding is concerned, I donate $20 here and there. It's not a charity, so there is no drain on taxpayers. I give the money because it is an organization that gives its members a say on the types of issues that we as a democracy see as important, and they do it far more effectively than any political party. So this gives you a feeling for what we're trying to build here. These 21st century movements where people actually, they're bought in. And it's sort of a really fascinating journey because this is so quick. This is like a few years into the organization being created. So next thing that I was involved in was an attempt to address this structural problem, which is that basically you've got this asymmetry at the global level between people and organized institutions. So if you think about the transnational level, the global level, you've got corporations who are by their nature organized transnationally. So if you're Nike or you're GE or you're any company, you're transnational, which means you're able to put a little bit of money here and move it there and all of the things that big companies do. They're organized multinationally. If you're a government or an elite, well, you have institutions through which to coordinate. You can go to Davos, or you can go to the G8 or the G20 or the World Bank. So there are all of these established institutions. So George Bush and Dick Cheney were exploiting this fear for their own political purposes, and Bin Laden and the jihadists were exploiting hatred for their own political purposes. But that actually ordinary people were much more aligned than you think, because the reality is that you do public opinion polling, and 75–80% of people in the Arab world actually want Middle East peace talks, and they want a settlement, etc. Whereas on extremes on both sides are sort of politicizing issues. So it's basically saying, let's find a way to align the views and values of the world's people with the outcomes in the world. So
is it going too fast? No? Is it okay?
Okay, good. Just give me that buster, that kind of. What is that expression? Is that what she does? She's very she gesticulates a lot, your president. So it's extraordinary. What was that? So this is a vase today. It has more than 10 million members. It's growing so fast that every time I do one of these talks, I have to update the number. It's completely global, and it's this experiment in kind of global cosmopolitan citizenship, which I think as we think about mobilization, and we'll talk about this later, having this global view is actually critical, because more and more this stuff.
Members. What do you mean by members? You're a member if you click I like Avaz in Facebook.
You're not a member if you like Avaz. That doesn't count. What does count is basically a member. It gives us the information that enables us to communicate with them on a regular basis. So email, country, zip code, telephone, mobile number, ways that we can begin to mobilize them over time. One of the critical insights, and we'll talk about this more later, of Avaz and Get Up and other forms of online organizing is that you make membership easy. You don't make it hard to become a member. And this is often the mistake that organizations make, which is if you're not really committed, if you don't show us that you're gonna get in the trenches on day one, maybe we don't want you, because we're here and we're really comfortable in our club. And that's the antithesis of the philosophy of this organization. We'll talk about what that looks like in practice in a moment. And this is an example of a campaign in Brazil that Avaz helped to wage, mobilizing 2 million people in favor of this Ficha Limpa law around corruption. So next thing is purpose, which is the thing that I now do and run, which is a home for movement building around the world. And basically, the model for purpose is twofold. We incubate new social movements, and we form partnerships to do mobilization where we think we have the capacity to mobilize large numbers of citizens and consumers. And this is part of our model. Part of our model is this concept of movement entrepreneurship. And by movement entrepreneurship, I mean that basically we believe that the best social movements are created by very small groups initially of highly committed people who create ways to organize. And so we've tried to take this movement entrepreneurship model, which is basically the model that was the Get Up, the Avaz model, right into Purpose, this new organization that we've created. And so we encourage our own staff to become movement entrepreneurs. And this is an example. This is Martine on our team. She had a huge crush on Jamie Oliver, the chef. Huge crush. And so we said, okay, why don't we try to partner with Jamie Oliver to organize people in the United States around food issues. Because there's this massive asymmetry on food where you've got like Monsanto and the beverage industry and Pepsi, running these bullshit kind of marketing campaigns on one side, but people have no means of being organized on the other. And so we formed a partnership with Jamie Oliver, and we're doing this movement building around food issues in the US. It's basically a dating service. And now she actually then met Jamie Oliver. And Jamie Oliver is a bit of a ladies' man. And her name is Martine, but he called her the lovely Martina. And so forevermore, now Martine is known as Martina. What was that? Exactly. We also look for gaps in the issue landscape, and we create new movements. So this is an example of a movement that we started this year, called All Out, a global gay rights organization. This is another example of an issue that's really global, right? So people who care about this issue, they're going to care if it's about Ugandans being persecuted, or if it's about Brazilians being killed in Rio, or if it's about marriage in New York. And so it's another one of these things where people always think in these geographic silos, but actually this is an issue that has identity politics. So anything that involves identity is incredibly powerful as an organizing kind of lever. And so we knew this, and when we started All Out, and so again, you had all of these organizations that were operating at the elite level. So there were these groups that were like, pacing the halls of the United Nations to try to get like a resolution in the UN about gay rights. And I'm not disparaging that work. That work is important, but it wasn't really getting very far, and it certainly wasn't mobilizing large numbers of people. So we decided to create an organization that would be the scale player on this issue. And so we're about 10 months in, and we already have 850,000 people who are part of this. So it's already, in terms of grassroots membership, bigger than any of these other groups. And so what that gives us the capacity to do is that when something big is happening on this issue, we can create a huge international story very quickly, in hours. Because the pace and the speed of communication these days mean that unless you can mobilize people very quickly, you actually are going to miss the opportunity to mobilize at all. And so these organizations are primed to rapidly mobilize. And they also are primed to popularize complex issues, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So, to come back to this idea of new kinds of agency, at Purpose, what we think about in a more systemic way is how do you mobilize multiple forms of power? So that there are more forms of power to mobilize than just political power. There's actually a huge amount of potential in mobilizing shareholders, cultural actors, and consumers in new way. So one of the big parts of our focus at Purpose, and we've just established a new unit just focused on this, is what does 21st century consumer power look like? Consumer activism. How can people use economic activism to create new business models and to transform, to build a low carbon economy, etc. And we've begun experiments in doing that, shifting people from conventional cars to electric cars, from dirty power to clean power, from big banks to credit unions or local banks. And we're thinking about how you use the same techniques to mobilize people around these economic acts. So you want to start a social movement. I don't know if any of you are interested, but here are some tips. Firstly, it's not about you. these are our friends from the 20th century, right? Some of these guys are great, some of these guys not so great. So, but these guys were all charismatic leaders. And so the thing that's distinguishing about the 20th century model of leadership was it was really about one guy, and it was a guy, except for Margaret Thatcher maybe, one guy getting up and being the guy and organizing these followers. And in many ways, that model is over. And it's a very vulnerable model, because the problem with that is that as soon as the individual figure comes under scrutiny, if you're Lance Armstrong and you have some drug tests that don't come out well, or if you're President Obama and you have to kind of run the country, and so people don't actually project all of their fantasies onto you, then suddenly you're the fallen guy, right? You're assassinated, metaphorically speaking. And so this insight about leadership, which is that being the kind of big charismatic leader is very limiting, is shaping these new movements. And so these new movements are not leaderless, they're leaderful. They have many leaders, but those leaders are not putting their cult of personalities out there. And I think this is a very, very important insight. You can get short-term kind of fizz from those personalities. You can use celebrity. Celebrities are very powerful in the course of your movements, but never tether the movement itself to the celebrity. Never tether the movement itself to one person. Make the movement about the members. Make the movement about the people who are in the movement. Use institutional power, but don't yourself become institutionalized. One of the most important decisions we made when we started groups like Get Up, Avaz, All Out, etc., was always to maintain their independence. To never, we could have gone and made a partnership on day one with a huge NGO, right? And when we started Get Up, we had this whole negotiation where we were deciding whether to partner with Greenpeace and make that a big partnership. If we'd done that, Get Up would be nowhere. Which is no disrespect to Greenpeace, but the reality is we would have been dragged down by the constraints and the politics and the bargaining and the interests of that other institution. And what we instead chose to do was just be very nimble. We knew we had to start small, but we knew that if we were nimble, we could be more creative, we could be more tactically innovative, and we could be more honest. And I think that's a really key insight. So when you think about institutions, be they companies who could give you money, or governments who could give you money, or governments who could give you political support, or other bigger players in your space, think about how to partner with them without becoming attached to them. And I think you'll find that the work will be more successful. Movements are not clubs. So to speak to this earlier point, this is fine. Movements aren't clubs. Speak to this earlier point, people shouldn't feel like you're exclusive. You're an exclusive club. I've been having some interesting conversations recently with Amnesty International, with the Secretary General of Amnesty, one of the great human rights organizations of the 20th century. One of the problems that they're having now is that people who are part of Amnesty, being part of Amnesty feels like a bit of a club. It's an exclusive club. And if you don't write your letters in the basement with the other old ladies, then maybe you're not part of the club. And so there's this problem, which is that they're not able to bring new people in because it gives people this vibe of exclusivity. And this is something that activists do. Activism is hard, and there is a sense of wanting to reward the biggest and best activists. But if you create a brand at an organization that has a club-like feeling, it's just not going to scale, especially not the way organizations can today. So this is a really important insight, I think. A movement is not an internet meme build for the long term. And this is sort of almost the flip side of this argument. I see a lot of internet memes that aren't really movements or serious efforts to mobilize. For example, you can make a brilliant video that lots of people watch and pass on to their friends. But if that isn't embedded in the context of a strategy to create power, to actually get the people who've seen the video to join the movement and then politicize those people systematically, it's really not that important. And this is a key insight, and this is also the insight that marketers are grappling with about the difference between the traditional kind of broadcast approach, which is we'll make something beautiful, people will be moved by it, and we'll have this sense that we've achieved something, versus this idea of really focusing on how you build power. And so, this is just a very basic framework, but clearly you want to systematically move people up a curve of engagement. If you've done your job well, some of those people end up self-organizing an event. They spend, weeks of their time working for you. They donate money. They share and create content, etc. So you want to think about, in the context of how you build movements, getting a lot of scale and then getting people mobilized. The other thing that I think is changing a lot because of this new media environment is that sloganeering is less powerful. Spin is less powerful. If you think about the 90s and the discourse about politics, it was always who had the best spin, who had the best line. And that made sense in the context of a mainstream media-dominated environment where there were limited avenues to get your message out and there wasn't a lot of interactivity, there wasn't a lot of two-way communication. But now, spin is much less powerful because unless spin is going to get taken by your followers, by your members, by your evangelists, and actually manipulated, changed, etc., it's not really going to disseminate. It's not going to spread because you need that sort of self-organizing mechanic in order for ideas to spread now. Ideas spread through Twitter, they spread through Facebook, they spread through these mechanisms. That is primarily how ideas are spreading now. So what that means is that as you think about your communication strategy and your messaging strategy, think more in terms of telling stories and less in terms of the slogan, the message, the kind of what's the one line at the end. And that's very powerful. So think about that. And I wanted to show you a video that GetUp did that I think is a great example of storytelling. But we'll see if we can get online later. Think about how you can be both global and hyperlocal. So the organizations we've created, many of them are both global, but at the same time, there's like a little group in Palermo, right? There's these small cells of these much more global things. So this gives people the sense that they're part of something very big, and you get all of the scale benefits of going global because people are more and more thinking globally, and they have identities that are more global, especially on issues like gay rights, where there's real identity politics. But at the same time, you can drill down using technology so that you can make everybody feel like they're part of something big. So, something that we did, we do a lot is, with LIVESTRONG, we did this, for example, one day where 1,200 events on one day all around the world around cancer activism. So people see their connection, that their little bake sale or their little sort of screening sort of party is embedded in a much bigger context, but they're also able to self-organize locally. Yeah, we've already seen that one. This is an important insight, I think, for kind of NGO folks. We've certainly found that starting with coalition building tends to fail. So if your method of social change is let's build a coalition of all of the existing organizations working in the space, usually doesn't work out very well. And this is important because usually this is how people think about scale. They think scale is about, well, look, if we get all these organizations who have all of these supporters and they're all in one, we all work together, then it will all, then we'll have all of the people. But actually, it doesn't really work that way because what you tend to get is these lowest common denominator dynamics. The story I like to tell, the horrifying story, is the story of the Make Poverty History campaign, which was the biggest mobilization of NGOs around global poverty in 2005 ever. And it was a fantastic campaign. It had some great success stories. But at the end of that, at the end of 2005, they had this email list of a couple of million people that should have been the basis of a long-term global anti-poverty organization. But what happened? The NGOs couldn't agree with what to do with the list or who owned it, and they threw it away. So all these people who'd gotten so inspired by that work in 2005, where were they going in 2006? Nowhere. They went back to their silos and that was it. And I think this is very important when you think about the work that you do. It goes back to this idea of not just creating short-term initiatives. If you're not in it for the long term, is it really going to make a big difference? You need to be thinking around issues, around areas where people have values and identity. This isn't something that's going to work for 6 months. You're either going to do this and build power for the long term, or you're probably not going to be doing very much at all. So think about that. So that's not to say that coalitions can't be very powerful, but I would use coalitions very specifically and opportunistically. So you've got a specific campaign, a specific thing you're doing where you want to get everybody together and make one big push. So, in Australia, we did this thing around climate. We got a carbon tax passed in Australia, which is fantastic. GetUp did that with Greenpeace, with with all the big environmental NGOs. We all organized together around that push, but it was not like a permanent coalition And I think that's an important distinction. Don't be obsessed with the technology. I think people get really obsessed with the technology, like, oh, we need an app. Why don't we have an app? Well, maybe apps aren't particularly useful because most people don't use them. So a lot of the work we do is super low tech. You see these sort of social movements in like Flash. That's ridiculous, right? So it's stuff like that. They're beautiful. They're sort of like, they're these kind of gorgeous, kind of moving, animated kind of, but like, that's not how it works. You need to make the button big and red, and there's certain kind of UX kind of principles. And so what you want to do is make it as easy as possible for someone to take action, not as kind of gorgeous as possible. And so that's a really important insight. Design is very important in our work. Our work has very, very high design standards because people want to feel like it's kind of beautiful, but the actual experience of taking action needs to be extremely simple and extremely pared down. And that's it. So I hope that was helpful and look forward to taking your questions.